The Nightmare of Camelot, an expose of the free trade Trojan Horse by Gus R.Stelzer, 1994. Chapter 5, Economic Law Number 4. M plus P plus G equals price. Ever since John F. Kennedy dreamt of a global Camelot, American industries, especially their management, have been the target of endless criticism. Kennedy himself was a leading critic. The rate of inflation between 1958 and 1962 was quite low and stable. The Consumer Price Index stood at 28.9 at the end of 1958 and 30.2 at the end of 1962. A rise of only 4.4% for an annual inflation rate of barely 1%. In the same time span, however, production costs were rising due to a 36% increase in federal, state, and local taxes, a rate of nearly 9% per year, plus higher costs stemming from civil rights activism starting in the mid-1950s. As a result, corporate profits were under siege. In this atmosphere, the United States Steel Corporation found it necessary in early September 1962 to announce a 3% increase in prices of certain categories of steel. Kennedy was outraged and promptly sent a curt message on the Friday before Labor Day to Roger Blah, CEO of U.S. Steel, to cancel the increase or appear in the Oval Office the following Tuesday morning. Under such pressure from the President of the United States, Blah rolled back the modest price increase and thereby hastened, along with imports of cheap steel per Kennedy's vision of a global Camelot, the near demise of U.S. Steel, resulting in a tragic loss of jobs for tens of thousands of American workers and billions of dollars in lost tax revenues for federal, state, and local governments. Because it has been a favorite American pastime to criticize business corporations for price increases, as well as a nagging concern about the ravages of inflation, it is proper now to consider what causes inflation, or more precisely, what causes prices to be what they are. No discussion of foreign trade policies and this expose of the free trade hoax can be on solid ground without addressing this vital factor. First, we must define the word inflation. Most textbooks and dictionaries define inflation as an increase in money supplies beyond the supply of goods, thus causing prices to rise. The noted economist Henry Hazlitt says, inflation is entirely a monetary phenomenon. Milton Friedman points to a currency printing press in Washington and says, here is the cause of inflation, and nothing else. Both definitions are simplistic and unrealistic. They do not explain, for example, why prices rise even when supplies rise beyond demand. As a result, a new word, stagflation, crept into our lexicon to denote the mystery of rising prices in slumping markets, contrary to the theory that falling demand is supposed to pull prices down. Further, while prices may fluctuate due to imbalances in the supply-demand equation over the short term, they tend to rise over the long term, as evidenced by the fact that in 1992, a recession year, it cost consumers $144 to buy the same things that cost $82 in 1980, and only $30 when Kennedy dreamt of Camelot in 1960. T-bone steaks that once sold for 50 cents a pound now cost $6, even though cattle ranchers complain of depressed markets. A car that cost $3,000 in 1960 now costs $18,000, even though dealer and factory lots are full of them and factories are closing due to excessive inventories. When we accept the law of supply and demand as a basis for inflation, we tend to be myopic. We fail to see that even when prices go down temporarily, they do not drop, as a general rule, below previous lows, whereas prices that rise usually rise above previous highs. In defining inflation, it is advisable that we do not get the cart before the horse by arbitrarily explaining its cause before saying what it is. Inflation would be more aptly defined as a rising level of prices, without attempting to say what may or may not be the cause of such price increases. Inflation is officially determined by the rise in prices of consumer goods as reflected in the Consumer Price Index, CPI, prepared by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It is not determined by comparing the supply of goods to the supply of money. More often than not, long-term increases in prices are not caused by higher money supplies, contrary to what monetarists like Hazlitt, Friedman, and Paul Volcker would have us believe. Nearly all interpretations of inflation stem from reliance on a demand-pull theory, whereby it is presumed that excessive money supplies or credit stimulates demand, which bids up prices. This theory may have validity with regard to the fluctuation of stock prices on the New York Stock Exchange, since the quantity of most stock issues is limited and is not reproduced on a daily basis. However, it has little effect on consumer goods, which are reproduced every day in mass volume. The fact that demand pull is a basis for most inflation theory should not come as a surprise, since the field of economics is dominated by financial people, bankers, trust managers, stockbrokers, and analysts who have a self-serving profit interest to keep the monetary ball in their court. Being involved in monetary affairs, they ordain themselves to be the custodians of price levels, and that it is entirely within the domain of the Federal Reserve, the Fed, and its thousands of member banks to determine what price levels, i.e., inflation, should be. There is considerable evidence over a period of 70 years that the Federal Reserve is not capable of controlling inflation without wrecking the national economy, ravaging the lives of millions of people, and being a major contributor to budget deficits. One official of the Federal Reserve once said, "We will have to wring inflation out of the people." That is like killing a patient to cure a cold and is totally unacceptable. It should not be the function of the Federal Reserve banking system or any branch of government to deliberately inflict misery on we the people on a contrived notion that only it has the power to maintain prices at stable levels. For example, when Paul Volcker was chairman of the Federal Reserve in the 1970s and early 1980s, he took it upon himself to tighten money supplies and raise interest rates to astronomical levels on a misguided premise that it was necessary to bring inflation under control. But the fact is that high inflation rates in those years were not caused by excessive money supplies. Lay the blame instead on a 12-fold increase in the price of oil between 1972 and 1979, a 175% increase in federal, state, and local taxes between 1970 and 1980, plus cost-inducing legislation for which the Fed had no responsibility. Yet, Volcker has been given credit for bringing inflation under control when, in fact, his policies exacerbated inflation rates and delayed their fall to lower levels. The high inflation rates of that era were reduced by at least 4 factors beyond the powers of the Fed. Number 1, a 50% reduction in the price of crude oil between 1980 and 1985. 2, the Reagan tax reduction program of 1982. 3, deregulation of controls on several industries. And 4, a major surge of imported consumer goods from nations with lower taxes and other politically mandated costs for which we have paid dearly in rising debt and social calamities. Instead of helping to restore the U.S. economy to desirable standards, Volcker's policies created the worst depression since the 1930s, caused millions of American workers to lose their jobs, bankrupted thousands of law-abiding businesses, triggered the savings and loans debacle, which subsequently cost taxpayers over $300 billion, and forced hundreds of other financial institutions to become insolvent. It created a contrived high-dollar exchange rate, which further aggravated trade deficits and the ability of U.S. industries to compete against producers in countries with weaker currencies, caused hundreds of state and local agencies to lose sorely needed tax revenues, and plunged our federal government into a new wave of budget deficits from which we have never recovered. It is doubtful that any government-related official inflicted more havoc on this nation since 1929 than Paul Volcker and the tight money policies of the Federal Reserve. Yet Volcker and the Fed are hailed as financial saviors and the guardians of our currency. Nothing could be farther from the truth. We will discuss this and other related subjects at greater length in the chapter, The Monetary and Banking Hoax. Suffice it to say here that the demand pull, tight money, recession-inducing, debt-creating theories of monetarism have little integrity. Monetary manipulations can stimulate or depress an economy and play tricks with unemployment and bankruptcies. In our neo-socialist system, it cannot be an effective or morally sound neutralizer of overwhelming, cost-inducing legislation. In fact, restriction of money supplies is often counterproductive because, as it curbs demand, it also reduces production and increases unit costs. In addition, it retards investment in advanced technology that would otherwise improve productivity and reduce unit costs. Tight money also creates added costs for aid to the unemployed and working poor, which must be offset by higher taxes and higher prices. Higher interest rates, as we will document, add to costs of capital, which must also be recovered in higher prices. Thus, contrary to monetary opinion, high interest rates and other restrictions on the availability of capital do not help to curb inflation. What then is the cause of inflation? What causes prices to be what they are, and what should be done to curb excessive price increases? First, let's throw out that stinking red herring about price increases being the result of excessive corporate profits. While there may be a few isolated cases of excess profits, their effect on our total economy is usually temporary and always smaller than a gnat's eye. On the other hand, profits are the lifeblood of a healthy economic and social order, and have been the primary factor in the development of the United States as the world's leading economic power with the highest living standards. Conversely, nations that resorted to unbridled socialism and communism and stifling of profit-motivated entrepreneurism have crumbled. Witness the fall of the Soviet Union and the turmoil in socialist Sweden. The survival of every business institution, its ability to maintain steady and well-compensated employment, and to function as a generator of taxes for necessary government services, depends wholly on adequate and consistent profits. The recent downsizing of U.S. corporations and the hundreds of thousands of employees whose jobs have been terminated should be ample evidence of the havoc created by lack of adequate profits. The tremendous losses suffered by General Motors alone have resulted in the loss of at least 400,000 jobs, including the supplier chain and the ripple multiplier effect, plus the loss of more than $20 billion a year in federal, state, and local tax revenues. At a time when our nation is wallowing in debt with no viable solution in sight, the losses incurred by General Motors stand as an indictment of the national, political, economic, and financial leadership of literally criminal proportions. Conversely, when profits are strong, employment is stable, wages expand, living standards rise, tax revenues flow into government treasuries, and corporations invest in new technology for greater productivity, more jobs, better wages, ad infinitum. Finally, corporate profits traditionally average less than 3% of sales, hardly enough to be considered a significant factor. Let's proceed with an understanding that profits are not the cause of rising prices. What then is the cause? On the assumption that we have now dispelled the fallacies of the demand-pull phenomenon, let us now recognize that prices, as a general rule, reflect costs, and that the prime catalyst in price inflation is the cost-push phenomenon. If we were to trace every man-made product back to its origin, we would find that it consists of elements extracted from the land, air, sea, or air, or as Bastiat phrased it, natural resources. That's where it all starts, and that's where prices start. Through complex, intertwining procedures of mining, planting, cultivating, harvesting, processing, designing, engineering, testing, fabricating, manufacturing, packaging, distributing, transportation, marketing, insurance, advertising, financing, legalities, service, and warranties, a finished product or service eventually arrives at the final point of consumption. It all started by extracting resources from the air, sea, or air, from the land, sea, or air. Throughout these intricate journeys, just three basic cost factors or components have been functioning, no more, no less. That brings us then to economic law number 4, which is all prices are the sum total of three cost components, which are money, people, and government. Thus, the equation is M plus P plus G equals price, which reaffirms a statement made in Chapter 3, that capital investment, labor, and government policies are the mechanisms of production, which in turn is the origin of all wealth. The three cost components, i.e., M plus P plus G, can be more broadly defined as follows. Cost component, money, also called capital, consisting of interest, dividends, profit or loss, capital gains, insurance, legal awards, capital equivalents such as land, building, property, etc. Cost component, people, also called labor, consisting of salaries, wages, commissions, fees, bonuses, fringe benefits, bribes, tips, perquisites, or any form of compensation for labor or services. Cost component G, government, also called taxes, consisting of individual and business income tax, Social Security tax, property tax, unemployment insurance tax, workmen's compensation tax, custom duties, tariffs, user fees, sales tax, gift or estate tax, excise tax, windfall tax, lotteries, or any other tax or fee levied by federal, state, and local governments. The ultimate price of every product or service is the sum total of these three components: money, capital, people, labor, government, taxes. It makes no difference whether the product be a chair, a shirt, tractor, an automobile, a ton of steel, wheat, shoes, haircut, legal services, cup of coffee, or hamburger. Monetarists would have us believe that prices are related to money supplies, but there is no record of any producer of a consumer product who based a price on measurement of money supplies. Instead, producers base prices on their cost in relation to anticipated volume and unit costs. If they do not, the chances are very good they will not be in business very long. To fully grasp the significance of economic law number 4, we should avoid thinking of costs in traditional accounting terms, such as materials, supplies, transportation, rent, utilities, advertising, management. If we trace each of such expense classifications back to their individual origins, land, sea, or air, we would find that they too consist of the three MPG cost components and nothing else. When news reports say that inflation was, let us say, 5% in a given period, due to a 6% increase in food, 7% for gasoline, 8% for used cars and clothing, etc., our minds are being diverted from the real underlying causes of the overall inflation rate. True, prices in each category may have risen by the reported amounts, but it is more important to understand that price levels rose as a result of increases in the cost of money, people, and or government, which must be recovered by the individual or business firm upon whom those costs are imposed if they are to remain viable. The alternatives to a failure to recover costs in each of the components are not good. 1. The level of design, selection, and or quality of the product will decline. Indeed, in many producing companies, engineers no longer devote their time to new product development, but to cost reduction engineering. which quite often leads to lower quality, less serviceability, less durability, and reduction of investment in new product designs. 2. The product will be discontinued and disappear from the marketplace. 3. The producer will go out of business. 4. The producer will stop making it in the U.S. and will import it from a foreign country where cost pressures are lower. Examples: Chrysler contracted with Mitsubishi in Japan to build cars sold by Chrysler dealers. Mattel Incorporated moved production of their Barbie doll to China and Mexico. Consumers are well aware that many quality products have completely disappeared from the marketplace or have been superseded by products of lower quality that quickly fall apart, can't be fixed, or are not backed up by convenient service locations where replacement parts and trained service personnel are available. The only choice for many consumers is to pay $60 an hour for repairs to the faulty item or buy a new one for $300. Some choice. CPI reports may say that average auto prices climbed X% over a given time period, but they don't tell us the size and weight of the average car has declined, is more vulnerable to collision damage and personal injury, doesn't ride as comfortably, and costs more to repair. Similarly, housing prices do not tell us that the average house is smaller, does not contain the quality details of former years, has dinky closets, walls that bend, hardware, if any, that falls apart. A 2x4 is no longer a 2x4. It's a 1 3/4 by 3 1/2. A choice steak is no longer choice and tastes like rubber. The nickel candy bar now costs 50 cents, but weighs only half as much. The junk or cost-driven generation is further reflected in the absence of someone to talk to in retail stores. There aren't enough clerks at the checkout counters, so you do a slow burn in a long line. The voice on the other end of the telephone is a recording machine which can't answer your question, but insists on reciting a long message that has no relationship to why you called. Letters go unanswered because we can no longer afford a staff to do that. The gas service attendant is past history, as is the service of checking your oil, water, and tire pressure. The consequences for the average consumer have been frustration, shattered nerves, increased tensions, the result of improved productivity, so they tell us. Yet we pay substantially more for these aggravating improvements. While all prices are the sum of just 3 cost components, each component is subject to an almost endless barrage of politically mandated or societal pressures. Here is just a partial list of such pressures. Government regulations: OSHA, EEOC, FCC, FTC, CPSC, ICC, NLRB, SEC, Department of Housing, Interior, Justice, Energy, Agriculture, Human Resources, Education, Labor, Transportation. Government operations: payrolls, buildings, parks, beaches, bridges, roads, streets, bureaucracies, red tape, overkill by committees, subcontractors. Environment and ecology: programs, restricted land use, forced utilization of land for non-intended purposes, building codes, endangered species, artifacts. Budget deficits, interest on national debt, effect on capital markets, people employed to service debt, taxes to cover interest on debt. Productivity, inadequate training, costs to retrain workers who lose their jobs, government intervention and regulations, work ethics. Consumer protection, excessive safeguards to protect consumers, irresponsibility of consumers, product recalls, warranty fraud by consumers, litigation, excessive and dubious product liability awards, malpractice suits, greatly extended legal procedures, class actions, conflicting laws, frivolous suits, deep pockets. National security, military programs, defense of other nations, space exploration, military payrolls and pensions, CIA, FBI, Federal Reserve, manipulation of money supplies and foreign currency exchange rates, discount rates, interest rates, etc. Education, public schools and universities, declining standards, bilingual studies, non-essential courses, loss of values and discipline. Civil rights and welfare, busing, food stamps, integration, white flight, equal rights, ERA, AFDC, equal pay, loss of management control. Immigration, welfare costs, erosion of jobs and tax base, crime, border patrols. Subsidies, farm programs, housing, education, elections, exports, imports, healthcare, students, unemployment, tax breaks to special interests. Labor, pro-union laws, strikes, coercion, restricted work standards, dues, vandalism, feather bedding, fringe benefits, paid holidays and vacations. Political fraud, pork barrels, bribes, payoffs, patronage, campaign deceptions, demagoguery, and more. News media, distorted and biased reporting and editorials, incomplete texts, anti-business agenda. Banking, usurious interest rates, tight money policies, World Bank, FDIC, FSLIC. Taxes, direct and indirect taxes in thousands of ways, complex codes, costs of tax counsel, court proceedings. Trade and professional groups, restrictions on competition, pressure on politicians, suppression of individual incentive, etc. Public apathy, uninformed electorate, what's the use attitudes, decline of individual responsibility and morality, breakdown of family values, lack of discipline, rising crime, inadequate parental guidance. All these and more affect the costs of producing goods and services in America, and, therefore, impact the price of every consumer product and service. It is significant to note that virtually all these cost pressures are the result of government mandates or failure of government to act responsibly. We should not leave this abbreviated list of cost-inducing political and societal mandates without reaffirming the most pervasive of all cost pressures as embodied in the cost component of government. As revealed in Chapter 4, the costs of government, represented by taxes, now constitutes 46% of the average consumer goods price. Moreover, such taxes assume grotesquely insidious proportions in that most of this huge burden is paid twice, once to tax bureaus and then again in the price of all consumer goods and services. It is vital to understand that virtually all of these coercive tax impositions on private industry are non-productive and are a primary cause of the difficulty experienced by U.S. producers in competing against producers in other countries. The combined weight of government taxation and regulatory laws accounts for well above 80% of the costs of the average U.S. product. Therefore, to blame any American company for its inability to compete against foreign producers is not only a blatant disregard for truth, it brings into question the moral integrity of our national conscience. We cannot be so lacking in intelligence that we cannot comprehend what is going on, so we have reason to question the moral soul of America, as will be done in another chapter. Any action of government that leads to the imposition of a cost on someone will result in an increase in one or more of the three basic cost components, MPG. Sooner or later, it will be reflected in one or a combination of the alternatives to cost pressures. 1. Prices go up. 2. Quality goes down. 3. Product disappears from the marketplace. Or 4. Production is transferred to another country where the costs of political and societal mandates are not as great, and we suffer the inevitable adverse economic and social consequences. To an alarming degree, we, as a society, are guilty of believing that we can get something for nothing. Nearly all of us, at one time or another, have demanded something from government or American industries without acknowledging that those who produce our goods and services must eventually absorb and recover the cost of our demands and tantrums. In so doing, all of us are part of the cost push phenomenon, which ultimately determines the price, design, and quality of every American product or service. That being the case, the tendency to blame American producers for alleged picayunish product deficiencies, or blaming them for not being price competitive against foreign producers, is an outrageous cop-out. If we believe certain American products are not competitive in design, quality, or price with products made in other countries, we should not tarnish our own integrity by blaming it on those who actually produce our goods and services under difficult and often impossible conditions and cost pressures. We should acknowledge that each of us had a part in determining the end results, especially if we are beneficiaries of any cost-inducing legislation, whether it be related to tax disbursements or regulatory laws. The chapter entitled The Ultimate Free Lunch will address this subject in detail. One final observation. As a result of a belief that prices are tied to monetary demand pull forces, monetarists are almost always globalists and free trade hardliners. That happens to be an ironic paradox, since monetarists also believe in restricting the flow and supply of money, in direct contradiction with the free market principles they universally advocate. As a consequence, monetarist free traders are unwilling to acknowledge the tremendous cost burdens placed on American producers by federal, state, and local political mandates. They prefer to blame producers, i.e., corporate managers and workers, for being inefficient, short-sighted, bloated, and overpaid. It is tantamount to entering a frog in an international jumping contest after tying weights to its legs. When the poor frog lags behind, internationalists berate him for his alleged incompetence. As we continue this expose of the global economy free trade hoax, let's keep in mind economic law number 4, which tells us that all prices are the sum total of the money, people, and government cost components.